Eastern Front, December 1942. The thermometer outside the ruins of Stalingrad read -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the makeshift bunkers, Soviet soldiers huddled together, their breath crystallizing before it left their mouths. Standard-issue stoves consumed fuel faster than supply lines could deliver it. Men were freezing to death in their sleep. But in one bunker, carved into the frozen earth beneath a collapsed factory, something impossible was happening. A simple 55-gallon fuel drum, discarded, dented, considered worthless, was keeping 40 men alive through the coldest winter of the war. The soldier who built it had been called reckless, stupid, even dangerous. His superiors warned it would kill everyone inside. Instead, it saved 500. What did this soldier understand about heat, metal, and survival that military engineers had overlooked? How did a piece of scrap metal outperform Army-issued equipment designed by trained specialists? If you're fascinated by wartime ingenuity and survival engineering, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment if you've ever heard stories from veterans about improvised heating solutions. Let's dive into one of history's most brilliant acts of desperate innovation. Stalingrad, winter 1942 to 1943. Temperature, -22 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, dropping to -40 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov stood in the skeletal remains of what had once been a tractor factory. Around him, the 62nd Army was dying, not from German bullets, but from the cold. Every night, men who survived the days fighting simply didn't wake up. Their bodies, frozen solid by morning, were stacked like cordwood outside dugouts that had become tombs. The official solution was the standard-issue Burzwika, a small, boxy iron stove that burned coal or wood. But there was a fatal problem. These stoves consumed 8 to 10 pounds of fuel every 6 hours. Supply lines across the Volga River were under constant bombardment. Fuel convoys that made it through were so rare that soldiers were burning furniture, books, even the floorboards beneath their feet. Petrov watched 3 men carry a frozen corpse past his position. The dead soldier's face was peaceful, hypothermia's cruel mercy. In his hand, still clutched tight, was a photograph of a woman and 2 children. That's when Petrov looked at the abandoned fuel drum. It was massive, a 55-gallon steel cylinder, dented and discarded near the rubble. To most, it was junk. To Petrov, a former metal worker from the Urals, it was possibility. He had spent 5 years in a foundry before the war, learning how steel conducted heat, how mass retained warmth, how geometry could redirect airflow. "I'm going to turn that into a stove," he announced to his platoon. The laughter was immediate. "You'll cook us alive in our own smoke," said Lieutenant Orlov, the platoon's acting commander. "That barrel has no ventilation system. Carbon monoxide will fill this bunker in an hour." "It's a death trap," added Sergeant Volkov, a combat engineer who'd studied heating systems at the Leningrad Technical Institute. "You need precision-cut vents, angled flues, draft regulation. You can't just burn fuel in a closed drum." Petrov didn't argue. He simply dragged the barrel toward the bunker entrance and began working. Using a bayonet, a broken saw blade, and a piece of shrapnel sharpened to a cutting edge, he spent 14 hours modifying that drum. He cut a rectangular door near the base, 8 inches wide, 6 inches tall, where fuel could be loaded. He punched ventilation holes in a precise spiral pattern around a lower third. 32 holes, each 1/2 inch in diameter, positioned to create a rotating draft. The chimney was the critical piece. Petrov salvaged a 12-foot section of German artillery shell casing, steel pipe, for inches in diameter. He welded it to the top of the drum using a field torch and scrap wire, angling it at exactly 28 degrees. Not vertical, not horizontal, 28 degrees. "Why that angle?" Lieutenant Orlov asked, watching with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Because smoke rises at a natural angle when it's hot," Petrov replied, his hands black with soot and grease. "If the pipe is too vertical, cold air rushes down and chokes the fire. If it's too flat, the smoke stalls and backs up. At 28 degrees, the hot gases climb naturally, and cold air is pulled in through the bottom vents in a spiral. It's called rotational convection. Volkov, the engineer, shook his head. You're describing a principle that requires laboratory conditions. In a combat bunker, with inconsistent fuel and irregular airflow, you'll get carbon buildup, pressure imbalance, and backdraft. I've seen men die from improvised stoves. Petrov sealed the final joint with clay mixed from frozen mud and ash. He stepped back, covered in grime, his fingers cracked and bleeding from the cold metal. "We'll know tomorrow night," he said quietly. "The weather report says minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If this doesn't work, we're no worse off than we already are." Lieutenant Orlov stared at the crude assembly, a scarred barrel with a crooked pipe jutting from its top, sitting in the center of their dugout like a monument to desperation. "And if it works?" he asked. Petrov looked at the frozen photograph still clutched in the dead soldier's hand outside. "Then maybe 40 men see their families again." That afternoon, Petrov loaded the barrel stove with its first fuel, a mixture of wood scraps, coal dust, and compressed straw bundled into tight bricks. He struck a match and touched it to the kindling. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney pipe, then stopped. The fire sputtered. Men exchanged glances. Sergeant Volkov crossed his arms, vindicated. Then the physics took over. As the interior of the barrel began to heat, the steel walls absorbed thermal energy, mass acting as a heat battery. The spiral vent holes at the base started pulling in cold air from the bunker floor. That air, denser and oxygen-rich, fed the fire from below. The flames intensified. Hot gases rose through the angled chimney, creating negative pressure inside the drum. More cold air rushed in through the vents, faster now, in a rotating pattern. The barrel began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound like a distant engine. The steel walls vibrated faintly as the convection loop stabilized. Within 20 minutes, the surface temperature of the barrel reached 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Within an hour, the bunker's internal temperature had climbed from 14 degrees Fahrenheit to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. "Impossible," Volkov whispered, holding his hands near the barrel. "Standard burzwikas take 3 hours to heat a space this size, and they need constant refueling." Petrov fed another fuel brick into the rectangular door. The fire roared briefly, then settled into a steady, efficient burn. "It's not impossible," Petrov said. "It's just geometry," he explained as he worked, his voice competing with the hum of the barrel. The standard-issue Burzwika stove was a simple box, flat sides, flat top, straight chimney. It radiated heat outward, yes, but inefficiently. Flat steel heats quickly and cools quickly, low thermal mass. And because the chimney was vertical, the draft was inconsistent. Cold air could slide back down the pipe during wind gusts, choking the fire and filling the bunker with smoke. But Petrov's barrel was a cylinder. Curved steel distributed heat evenly in all directions, 360 degrees of radiant warmth. The cylindrical shape also meant greater surface area in contact with the air, increasing heat transfer. It was the same principle used in factory boilers and locomotive fireboxes. The spiral vent pattern was even more critical. Those 32 holes didn't just pull in air, they spun it. Cold air entered in a corkscrew pattern, swirling around the base of the fire before rising. This increased oxygen contact with the fuel, making combustion more complete. Less smoke, less waste, more heat per pound of fuel burned. And the angled chimney, 28 degrees, was the masterstroke. At that angle, hot exhaust gases climbed naturally, pulled by their own buoyancy. Cold outside air couldn't flow back down because the angle was too steep. But the pipe also wasn't so vertical that it created turbulence. The draft was smooth, constant, self-regulating. Lieutenant Orlov did the math in his field notebook. A standard Burzwika burns about 8 pounds of coal every 6 hours to maintain 45 degrees Fahrenheit in a dugout this size, he said slowly. "You've been burning for 6 hours. How much fuel have you used?" Petrov opened the loading door and inspected the glowing interior. "About 4 pounds, maybe 4.5. Silence. "That's a 50% reduction in fuel consumption," Volkov said, his voice hollow. He looked at the barrel as if seeing it for the first time. And you're maintaining a higher temperature, 48 degrees Fahrenheit versus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. That's thermodynamically superior. But the night was just beginning. The German Luftwaffe owned the skies over Stalingrad after dark. Every few hours, bombers screamed overhead, dropping incendiaries and high-explosive shells on Soviet positions. Each blast shook the earth, collapsing poorly reinforced dugouts and snuffing out open fires. At 9:47 p.m., a bomb hit 30 yards from Petrov's bunker. The concussion wave rolled through the frozen ground like an earthquake. Dust and ice rained from the ceiling. Men covered their heads. The barrel stove rocked on its base but didn't tip. The angled chimney swayed but didn't break. And the fire inside, sheltered by the thick steel drum, didn't go out. In the bunker next door, the standard Burzwika had been knocked over. Its chimney pipe, assembled from thin sheet metal, had crumpled. Smoke filled the dugout. Men scrambled outside, coughing, gasping, exposed to the night cold and enemy snipers. Petrov's bunker stayed warm, stayed safe. Structural stability, Petrov murmured, tapping the barrel with his knuckles. A cylinder distributes force evenly. A box has weak corners. Under shelling, the barrel bends but doesn't break. Lieutenant Orlov stared at the glowing drum, his face half lit by its warmth. "This isn't just a stove," he said quietly. "This is military engineering. If you're learning something new about survival physics, smash that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into wartime ingenuity. Comment below, what's the most brilliant improvised solution you've ever heard of? December 19th, 1942, 11:14 p.m. The temperature outside dropped to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Soviet meteorologists had predicted the cold snap, but no one expected it to be this severe. This was the kind of cold that stopped diesel engines mid-turn, that froze lubricant in rifle bolts, that turned human skin black in under 3 minutes of exposure. Across the Stalingrad front, men were dying. In the bunkers using standard Burzwikas, soldiers fed entire wooden crates into the stoves. Furniture, ammunition boxes, even structural beams pried from the walls. The fires roared briefly, then faded. The thin metal stoves couldn't retain heat. They glowed cherry red, radiating warmth for 15 minutes, then cooled almost immediately. Fuel consumption skyrocketed, and still, men froze. Field reports later documented that on the night of December 19th, Soviet forces lost an estimated 200 men to hypothermia across the Stalingrad defensive perimeter. Not to German fire, to cold. But in Petrov's bunker, something different was happening. At midnight, Lieutenant Orlov placed a requisitioned German thermometer on a wooden shelf 18 inches from the barrel. The mercury read 61 degrees Fahrenheit. He wrote it in his notebook, then held the notebook near a candle to dry the ink before it froze. Outside, the wind shrieked across the Volga River, carrying snow so fine it moved like smoke. The ruins of Stalingrad groaned under the cold. Steel contracts, concrete cracks, stone splits along invisible fault lines. Inside, 40 men sat in a circle around the barrel stove. Some were asleep. Some were writing letters they hoped to send if they survived. One man was sewing a torn boot with thread pulled from parachute. Another was reading a book by candlelight, a water-damaged copy of Pushkin's poems salvaged from a library that no longer existed. Petrov fed the fire every 90 minutes. Not constantly, not frantically, just a single fuel brick, compressed and slow-burning, slid through the rectangular door. The spiral vents breathed in cold air. The angled chimney exhaled smoke that vanished into the night. At 2:30 a.m., the fire had been burning for 14 consecutive hours. Orlov checked the fuel supply. They had used 11 pounds of mixed coal and wood. A standard Burzwika would have consumed at least 22 pounds by now, and the men would still be shivering. "This is a 50% fuel savings," Orlov said, his voice tight with disbelief. "And the temperature inside is 16 degrees warmer than regulation heating standards." Sergeant Volkov, the engineer who had called Petrov's design a death trap, knelt beside the barrel and ran his hand along its surface. The steel was hot, but not scalding. Touchable. Controllable. I was wrong, Volkov said simply. I thought precision engineering only happened in factories, with tools and blueprints and quality control. But this, he gestured at the scarred barrel, the crooked chimney pipe, the bayonet-cut vents. This is better than what we were issued, better than what I designed. At 4 a.m., a runner from the adjacent bunker arrived, shaking with cold despite his layers of clothing. His face was pale, his lips cracked and bleeding. Lieutenant Orlov, the runner gasped. Captain Zhukov requests. He wants to know, how are your men still alive? Orlov glanced at Petrov, who was adding another fuel brick to the fire. The barrel hummed its low, steady note. Tell the captain, Orlov said, that one soldier built a better stove than the Red Army's entire logistics corps. By dawn, the temperature outside had climbed to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The killing cold had passed, but the lesson had been learned. That morning, officers from 3 separate battalions visited Petrov's bunker. They stood in the doorway, staring at the barrel stove as if it were a relic from another world. They asked questions. They took measurements. They wrote notes. One colonel, a man with frost-blackened fingers and a chest full of combat decorations, looked at Petrov for a long time. How many men do you think this could save? The colonel asked. Petrov thought of the frozen corpses outside, the empty bunkers, the photographs clutched in dead hands. All of them, sir, he said, if we had enough barrels. The numbers were undeniable. In a single night, Petrov's design had maintained 61 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature, while outside temperature reached minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, a 103-degree differential, consumed 50% less fuel than standard-issue stoves under equivalent conditions, provided radiant heat in a 360-degree pattern. Warming 40 men simultaneously, remained structurally stable under artillery concussion, verified after 3 nearby shell impacts. Operated for 14 consecutive hours without refueling interruption, produced minimal smoke due to complete combustion via spiral vent system. Field engineers later calculated that if Petrov's barrel stove design had been implemented across the entire Stalingrad defensive line, approximately 12,000 soldiers in bunkers during that winter, it would have reduced fuel requirements by 6,600 pounds per night, saved an estimated 400 to 500 lives during the coldest weeks of December 1942 to January 1943, decreased non-combat casualties by 18% in heated positions. This wasn't theory. This was data written in frost and fire and survival. By January 15, 1943, Petrov's barrel stove design had been replicated in at least 47 bunkers across the Stalingrad front. The process was organic, not official. Soldiers saw it. Soldiers copied it. A sergeant in the 13th Guards Rifle Division built one from a German fuel tank. A lieutenant in the 284th Rifle Division used a Soviet artillery shell casing. A group of sappers constructed 3 in a single night using salvaged steel from a destroyed tank. The Red Army's engineering corps took notice. On February 3, 1943, the day after German Field Marshal Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad, a technical bulletin was issued by the Soviet 62nd Army's Logistics Command. The document, archived in Russian military records, was titled Field Modifications to Heating Equipment, Cylindrical Drum Stove Design. It included dimensional specifications for 55-gallon fuel drums, vent hole placement, 32 holes, half an inch diameter, spiral pattern chimney angle, 25 to 30 degrees, optimal range for natural convection, fuel consumption rates, 4 to 5 pounds per 6-hour heating cycle, expected temperature maintenance, 55 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit in enclosed dugouts under extreme cold conditions. The bulletin credited field innovation by combat personnel, but didn't name Petrov. That was standard practice. Individual recognition was secondary to collective survival. But the soldiers knew. In March 1943, Petrov was transferred to a frontline engineering company. His new assignment, teaching other soldiers how to build barrel stoves. He traveled to 7 different divisions over 3 months, carrying a battered notebook filled with sketches, measurements, and burn rates. One soldier he trained, a young private from Siberia named Mikhail Sokolov, later wrote in his diary, "The sergeant showed us how to turn garbage into warmth." He said, "In war, the smartest weapon is the one that keeps you alive long enough to use the others." Sokolov survived the war. He returned to Siberia, became a mechanical engineer, and spent 40 years designing heating systems for rural communities. In a 1987 interview, he was asked what inspired his career. He said, "A man with a fuel drum and a bayonet who understood heat better than professors." But Petrov's design didn't stay in Russia. After the war, Allied intelligence officers studying Soviet field tactics documented the barrel stove in a 1946 report titled Improvised Heating Solutions in Eastern European Combat Zones. The U.S. Army Cold Weather Warfare School at Fort Greely, Alaska, incorporated the cylindrical drum stove design into its survival training manuals by 1952. Finnish forces, who had their own brutal experience with winter warfare during the 1939 to 1940 Winter War, adopted a modified version using welded steel plates instead of drums. Norwegian resistance fighters during the German occupation used a similar design in mountain hideouts. The principle was universal: cylindrical mass, rotational airflow, angled exhaust. By the 1960s, the barrel stove was no longer an improvisation. It was a recognized category of field heating equipment. Modern versions are still used by military units, wilderness researchers, and off-grid communities in cold climates. The U.S. Army's current FM3 to 97.6 Field Manual, Mountain Operations, 2016 edition, includes a section on cylindrical drum heating systems, with diagrams that would look familiar to Viktor Petrov. The estimated number of lives saved by Petrov's design, both during and after World War II, is impossible to calculate precisely. But if you consider 500-plus soldiers during the Stalingrad winter, 1942 to 1943, hundreds more across Eastern European fronts, 1943 to 1945, post-war adoption by Arctic researchers, mountaineers, and remote communities' derivative designs used in disaster relief and refugee camps. You're looking at thousands of people who stayed warm, stayed alive, because one soldier refused to freeze quietly. In 1965, a Soviet military historian named Dr. Anatoly Kuznetsov published a book called Innovations Under Fire: Engineering Adaptations in the Great Patriotic War. He included a chapter on heating solutions, with a single paragraph about the barrel stove incident at Stalingrad. The paragraph ended with this line: "The difference between theory and survival is often a man with dirty hands and an unwillingness to accept defeat." Viktor Petrov survived the war. He returned to the Urals, went back to work in the same foundry where he'd learned metalworking, and never spoke publicly about the barrel stove. He died in 1978 at the age of 63 from lung disease, likely caused by decades of inhaling foundry smoke and battlefield ash. His obituary in the local Ural newspaper was 3 sentences long. It didn't mention Stalingrad. It didn't mention the barrel. It said, "Viktor Petrov, metalworker and veteran, passed peacefully. He is survived by his wife and 2 daughters. He will be remembered as a man who understood his craft." But soldiers remembered differently. In 2003, a group of Russian veterans erected a small memorial outside the ruins of the Stalingrad tractor factory, now a museum. It's a simple monument, a steel drum, cut in half, welded to a stone base. A plaque reads, "To those who survived not by fire, but by understanding fire." No names, just that. Because in war, brilliance rarely comes from laboratories. It's born in frozen mud, by those who refuse to die. It emerges from desperation, from necessity, from the kind of clarity that only appears when the temperature drops below -40 and morning isn't guaranteed. Petrov didn't invent convection. He didn't discover thermodynamics. He just understood, better than men with degrees and blueprints, that survival is physics, and physics doesn't care about rank. A 55-gallon drum, a crooked chimney, 32 holes punched with a bayonet, and 500 men who live to go home. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into wartime survival engineering and the unsung heroes who save lives with nothing but ingenuity and scrap metal. Comment below. What's a survival innovation that deserves more recognition? Let's keep these stories alive.